to kill me, to keep me from killing you.
Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair were two of the biggest names professional wrestling had ever produced, but for years, their paths existed in completely different worlds. Hogan was the larger-than-life hero who turned Hulkamania into a global phenomenon, while Flair was the arrogant, flamboyant nature boy who had built his own legacy through championship victories, legendary rivalries, and decades of unforgettable performances. Fans could debate who was greater, but there was one question that had never been properly answered. What would happen if these two icons finally stood across the ring from each other? In 1994, WCW decided to find out. What followed was supposed to be the ultimate dream rivalry. Instead, it became the beginning of a story that would eventually stretch across factions, championships, power struggles, and one of the most important transformations in wrestling history. When Hulk Hogan arrived in WCW in 1994, the company knew exactly what it had in front of it. Hogan wasn't simply another superstar changing promotions. He was one of the most recognizable wrestlers on the planet, and WCW wanted to build its future around him. But bringing Hogan into the company also created an obvious problem. If he was going to become the centerpiece of WCW, who could possibly stand across from him and feel like an equal? The answer was Ric Flair. Flair had already spent years carrying major promotions and had become synonymous with WCW. He had the credibility, the history, and the personality to make the matchup feel enormous. Hogan had Hulkamania. Flair had the Nature Boy. Hogan represented the ultimate American wrestling hero, while Flair represented the arrogant champion who believed the entire business belonged to him. The stage was finally set at Bash at the Beach in July 1994. Hogan entered WCW's biggest spotlight with an enormous amount of attention surrounding him, and waiting on the other side was Ric Flair. The match wasn't simply promoted as another championship contest. It was presented as the collision of two wrestling empires. Hogan wanted to prove that his arrival meant WCW now belonged to him, while Flair wanted to remind everyone that there was a reason he had been considered one of the greatest wrestlers alive. The atmosphere surrounding the match reflected the importance of the moment. Every move carried the weight of years of anticipation because fans had spent so long imagining what this confrontation might look like. When the match was finally over, Hogan had defeated Ric Flair and captured the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. Hogan had arrived, beaten one of the company's most established legends, and immediately placed himself at the top of WCW. But the victory didn't settle the argument between the two men. If anything, it created an even bigger problem for Flair. He had just lost to the man who was supposed to represent the new era of WCW, and now Hogan was standing at the top of the company with the championship around his waist. Flair wasn't going to simply accept that. Their rivalry continued into the fall, leading to Halloween Havoc in October 1994. This time, the stakes were even more intense because Hogan and Flair were placed inside a steel cage. The cage removed the possibility of outside interference, deciding the outcome, and created an environment where the two legends could settle their differences directly. Flair needed a victory to regain momentum, while Hogan wanted to prove that his first victory was no fluke. But once again, Hogan survived and defeated Flair. Two major matches had now produced the same result. Hogan had beaten Flair, but the story was far from finished. In wrestling, losing can sometimes make a rivalry more interesting, especially when the person who loses refuses to accept the result. Flair's frustration became part of the story, and his relationship with Hogan remained one of the most important attractions WCW could return to whenever it needed a major confrontation. But instead of immediately repeating the same match again and again, the company began expanding the conflict. Flair eventually stepped away from the spotlight, but his absence didn't erase what had happened. Hogan remained one of WCW's biggest stars, and the idea of Flair as the man capable of challenging him never completely disappeared. When Flair returned, the rivalry began moving in a different direction. It was no longer simply about two men trying to prove who was better. Flair was surrounded by some of the most dangerous wrestlers in WCW, and Hogan was becoming increasingly involved with his own allies. The battlefield was growing. By 1995, the story had evolved into a larger conflict involving the Four Horsemen. Ric Flair was one of the defining figures of the Horsemen, and the group represented everything that made WCW's old-school wrestling culture so dangerous. Arn Anderson, Brian Pillman, and later other major names became connected to the ongoing struggle. Suddenly, Hogan wasn't simply defending himself against Ric Flair. He was dealing with a group of wrestlers who could attack from multiple directions and turn a singles rivalry into an all-out war. That change was important, because it showed just how difficult it was for WCW to keep Hogan and Flair confined to one simple storyline. Both men had become larger than individual matches. Their histories were too deep, their reputations were too big, and their connections to other wrestlers were too important. Flair had the Horsemen, while Hogan had his own circle of supporters. Every confrontation had the potential to bring more people into the fight. And while the Hogan-Flair rivalry continued to develop, something even bigger was beginning to happen behind the scenes in WCW. The company was moving toward a period of change that would completely transform professional wrestling. The arrival of new stars, changing alliances, and growing competition with WWE created an atmosphere where the old rules of WCW were beginning to disappear. By 1996, the wrestling world was about to change forever. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash arrived in WCW and immediately began creating uncertainty. They presented themselves as outsiders, men who had come into WCW with an attitude that suggested they didn't care about the established order. At first, nobody knew exactly what their presence meant. But as the story developed, it became clear that Hall and Nash weren't there simply to have matches. They were there to change WCW. Then came the moment that changed Hulk Hogan's career. For years, Hogan had been one of wrestling's most recognizable heroes. The red and yellow colors, the positive messages, the massive reactions from fans, everything about Hogan had been built around the idea that he was the ultimate good guy. But at Bash at the Beach 1996, Hogan shocked the wrestling world by turning against the fans and joining Hall and Nash. Hogan was no longer the same man. He became Hollywood Hulk Hogan, and with that transformation came the birth of the New World Order. The decision changed WCW overnight. Hogan was now leading a group that openly challenged the company's established wrestlers and fans. The man who had once represented the traditional wrestling hero had become the face of rebellion. For Ric Flair, this created an entirely different kind of enemy. The Hogan he had fought in 1994 was already a massive star, but he was still operating within the traditional structure of professional wrestling. Hollywood Hogan was different. He wasn't interested in simply winning championships, he wanted control. The NWO wanted to disrupt WCW, recruit its wrestlers, and establish itself as the dominant force in the company, and Flair represented almost everything the NWO wanted to destroy. Flair was part of the old wrestling establishment. He represented history, tradition, championship prestige, and the idea that WCW belonged to the wrestlers who had built it. Hogan represented a new era, one where the rules were being rewritten. Their rivalry had suddenly gained a deeper meaning. This wasn't just Hogan against Flair anymore. It was the old WCW against the New World Order. The Four Horsemen became one of the most important forces, standing against Hogan and the NWO. Flair was joined by Arn Anderson, Steve Mongo McMichael, and Chris Benoit in a new version of the legendary group. Their mission was clear: fight back against the faction that was threatening to take over WCW. This created one of the most fascinating contrasts in the company's history. The Four Horsemen had once been the group that terrorized everyone else. Now they were fighting to defend WCW from an even larger threat. Ric Flair, who had spent years playing the role of the arrogant champion, was now positioned as one of the company's most important defenders. The conflict eventually reached WarGames in 1996, one of WCW's most famous concepts. Inside the double ring structure, teams were locked into a brutal environment where alliances and survival mattered as much as individual wrestling ability. The Four Horsemen and their allies were fighting the NWO, and the significance went far beyond another faction match. WCW had effectively created two competing visions of professional wrestling. On one side stood Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen, representing the history of the company and the traditional wrestling world. On the other stood Hollywood Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and the New World Order, representing disruption, rebellion, and a completely different approach to wrestling. And that made the Hogan-Flair rivalry more complicated than it had ever been. Back in 1994, the question was simple: could Ric Flair defeat Hulk Hogan? 2 years later, that question barely described what was happening anymore. Now the question was whether Flair and the Horsemen could stop Hogan and the NWO from taking over WCW. The dream match had become a war, but there was another reason this rivalry mattered so much. Hogan and Flair were not simply two wrestlers who happened to be working in the same company. They represented two different eras of professional wrestling. Flair had spent years establishing the style, attitude, and traditions that made him one of the most respected names in the industry. Hogan had helped turn wrestling into a mainstream phenomenon and had become one of its most recognizable stars. Now, in 1996, both legacies were colliding again, but this time under completely different circumstances. Hollywood Hogan had reinvented himself, and the NWO had become a force that seemed almost impossible to control. Flair and the Horsemen had accepted the challenge, but fighting the NWO was becoming increasingly dangerous. The group had numbers, influence, and the ability to disrupt almost every major storyline in WCW. For Flair, this wasn't just another chance to fight Hogan. It was a fight for the identity of WCW itself. And that was what made the next chapter so important. The rivalry that had begun with a championship match at Bash at the Beach in 1994 had now evolved into something neither man could have predicted. Hogan had gone from WCW's biggest hero to the leader of its most dangerous faction. Flair had gone from Hogan's individual challenger to one of the central figures fighting against the NWO's growing power. The two men had started as rivals, trying to prove who was the bigger legend. Now they were symbols of two completely different sides of professional wrestling, and as the NWO continued spreading through WCW, the Four Horsemen prepared for the fight of their lives. Ric Flair had faced Hulk Hogan before. He had lost to him. He had watched Hogan become champion. He had watched him transform. But now, for the first time, Flair wasn't simply trying to defeat Hogan inside the ring. He was trying to stop Hollywood Hulk Hogan from changing WCW forever. And the most dangerous part was that the war was only beginning.